Welcome to What Dwells Beneath, a descent into the true crime cases, paranormal encounters, and ancient legends that refuse to be buried, no matter how deep we dig. I'm Perzival, your lantern bearer in the dark, and your guide through the places most people choose not to look. With me always is our producer, Neku, and our research assistants, Hannah and Eleanor, whose work makes every shadow in this show possible. Tonight, we travel deep into the fog-drenched banks of the Ohio River, to Point Pleasant, West Virginia. This is a quiet town where the past refuses to stay buried. The river moves slow and dark, carrying whispers of old tragedies on its cold currents. Abandoned factories and rusting silos loom like skeletal guardians, slowly being reclaimed by ivy and time. The rolling hills and dense woodlands seem to watch with an ancient, patient eye. At twilight, their air grows thick and heavy, carrying the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, pine resin, and something else. Something electric and metallic, like the charged stillness right before lightning splits the sky open. This is the realm of the Mothman. Not a moth, not quite a man, a towering winged figure with glowing red eyes that pierce straight through the soul. Massive wings that can blot out the moon and stars, and an overwhelming aura of impending doom that settles into your bones like winter frost. First sighted in the mid-1960s, this entity became forever linked to one of the worst tragedies in West Virginia history, the sudden and catastrophic collapse of the Silver Bridge in 1967 that claimed 46 innocent lives. But Mothman is far more than a local cryptid or a scary story told around the campfire. He's a harbinger, a messenger from realms beyond our understanding, a being that exists in the gray, liminal space between flesh, spirit, nightmare, and prophecy. Tonight, we plunge deep into the paranormal heart of the legend. We'll walk the haunted back roads and overgrown bunkers of Point Pleasant with those who came face to face with the impossible. We'll examine the high strangeness that surrounded every sighting. Swarms of UFOs menacing men in black, telepathic visitors with fixed grins, and prophetic warnings that went tragically unheeded. We'll explore the powerful idea that Mothman appears when the veil between worlds thins and disaster draws near. Only toward that very end will we gently touch on more earthly explanations. But first, we honor the mystery in all its unsettling, wing-beating glory. So grab your headphones, turn off the lights, and lock the doors. Because whatever's out there tonight doesn't knock. To understand the Mothman, you first have to understand Point Pleasant, because this isn't a town that arrived at darkness unprepared. It had been walking towards something terrible for a very long time. Point Pleasant sits at the center of the Kanawha and Ohio rivers, a geographical crossroads that made it strategically vital and spiritually charged in equal measure. Long before European settlers arrived, the indigenous people of the region regarded the river junction as a liminal place, a threshold where the world of the living pressed uncomfortably close to something older and less welcoming. The Shawnee called this land their own, and it was near this very ground that one of the first and bloodiest battles of the American Revolutionary War was fought. On October 10th, 1774, the Battle of Point Pleasant left hundreds dead on both sides. The earth here drank deeply of violence and grief from its earliest recorded days. By the 20th century, Point Pleasant had settled into the rhythms of a modest river town. Steel industry jobs, family-owned diners, church on Sunday. But the economic tides were already beginning to recede. The factories that had anchored the community were aging. The young were quietly beginning to leave. There was this unspoken feeling, the kind you only recognize in hindsight, that something was ending. And then, during World War II, the U.S. military selected that area just outside of Point Pleasant for something that would permanently alter the landscape. And perhaps, some believe, something far deeper than that. About 7 miles north of downtown Point Pleasant lies what locals call the TNT Area, but that sterile, bureaucratic label does nothing to prepare you for what this place actually feels like when you walk it at dusk. During World War II, the U.S. Army built the West Virginia Ordnance Works on this very land, a massive, sprawling complex used to manufacture and store TNT along with other explosives for the war effort. At its peak, the facility employed over 3,000 workers. To store the ordnance, engineers constructed hundreds of concrete igloo-shaped bunkers, semi-buried in the earth and scattered across hundreds of acres of scrubland, forest, and wetlands. These igloos still stand today, and many of them are sealed, but some are not. When the war ended, the ordnance workers were decommissioned. The land passed through various hands, briefly the military, then state managed for wildlife. But decommissioned does not mean clean. The soil throughout the area is contaminated with TNT compounds, along with heavy metals and other industrial byproducts that leached into the ground over decades of wartime production. Some researchers have pointed to this chemical legacy as the possible explanation for mutations in local wildlife, but others suggest something more exotic. That the government's Cold War era activities on this land, less well documented than World War II history, left behind traces of something stranger than explosives. What is not in dispute is the atmosphere of this place. The bunkers rise from the earth like the skulls of buried giants. The trees grow crooked and close. The wetlands surrounding the complex are dark, still, smell of sulfur and rot. After the war, teenagers used this area for parties and dares, and it quickly developed a reputation as a place where the air felt wrong, where your car radio would cackle and die, where you'd hear sounds that had no source, where the feeling of being watched was not merely psychological, but almost tactical. This is where the Mothman would first be seen. Not in town center, not along the river, but here, in this contaminated, forgotten wilderness of concrete igloos and crooked trees, where secrets have been buried in the earth for decades. Let's walk the timeline together, month by month, feeling the weight of each sighting as the terror slowly built across Point Pleasant and the surrounding areas, like a storm gathering on the horizon that no one could quite see coming. It all began on November 12, 1966. 5 men were digging a grave in a cemetery near Clendenin, West Virginia, when a large, brown, man-like figure with wings flew low and completely silent over their heads from a nearby stand of trees. It moved with deliberate purpose, then vanished into the gathering dusk, leaving the men shaken, but initially reluctant to speak about what they had seen. That single moment would mark the beginning of something much larger, a wave that would soon wash over the entire region. Just 3 days later, on November 15th, the legend truly ignited. 2 young couples, Roger and Linda Scarberry, along with Steve and Mary Mallet. They were cruising near the TNT area on a warm autumn night, the kind of night where the stars feel close, but something darker feels closer. Their headlights swept across the road and caught a massive shape on the shoulder. It rose slowly, deliberately, as if it had been waiting there for this exact moment. What stood before them was nearly 7 feet tall. Its shoulders were enormous, almost grotesquely wide, and from them hung wings folded like a dark cloak. Wings so vast that when they spread, they blocked out the tree line on the other side of the road. The skin was molted grayish-brown. There was no visible beak, no feathers. This was not a bird in any sense they understood. And then the eyes. 2 burning, hypnotic red orbs that seemed to glow with their own light, not reflecting the headlights, but generating something from within. Witnesses later said those eyes didn't look at you as much as into you, past your face, past your thoughts, into something deeper and more frightened underneath. The couples didn't wait, they drove fast, and I mean fast. The Mothman followed. It launched into the air without a running start, simply rose, unfolded those massive wings and kept pace with their vehicle as they pushed over 100 miles per hour. They rushed down dark country roads toward the lights of Point Pleasant. The witnesses later described it as not so much flying as gliding at impossible speeds. Wings barely moving, its silhouette somehow darker than the dark sky behind it. The dread it radiated was not just fear, it was something more specific and more terrible. That feeling that something had seen them, marked them, and wasn't finished with them yet. They burst into the sheriff's office, pale and trembling, all four of them, telling the same story in the same detail. Deputy Millard Halstead drove them back to the TNT area. He saw nothing, but his radio emitted strange, distorted sounds he couldn't explain for the duration of the visit. The very next night, November 16th, Marcella Bennett was visiting her friends near the TNT area with her young daughter Tina and her brother-in-law Raymond Wamsley. As they walked toward the house, a shape rose from the ground near the parked car. Not from the sky, but from the ground. As if it had been crouched there, waiting in the dark, watching them approach. Bennett dropped her daughter. She didn't mean to. Her body simply stopped working for a moment, overwhelmed by something she couldn't process. She described this creature as headless, not decapitated, headless, in the sense that where a head should have been, there was only those two burning red eyes, floating in the darkness above massive, hunched shoulders. Bennett and her family quickly made it inside the house. When they got in, the family waited in silence, hoping whatever was outside would leave. But this is when the creature pressed itself against the window. After a while, it did leave. Bennett would struggle with the aftermath of that night for years. Not just fright, but a specific lingering trauma that she described as feeling violated in a way she couldn't describe. As if something had looked at her that had no business looking. As if she had been assessed and found interesting. Throughout the rest of November and all of December 1966, reports poured in almost nightly. The Mothman was seen perched silently on rooftops overlooking the town, or gliding over the Ohio River like a shadow given form, standing motionless in graveyards as if keeping vigil over the dead, and circling low over homes and passing cars. Dogs vanished without a trace. Telephones rang with nothing but static or unearthly mechanical voices. Strange lights and metallic crafts filled the skies above the TNT area. The wave was building, the frequency was rising, and most of Point Pleasant had no idea how close to the edge they were standing. Any serious investigation of Mothman cannot skip past the Men in Black, because in Point Pleasant, they were not an abstract conspiracy theory. They were a flesh and blood presence who showed up at witnesses' doors, sat across from terrified people in their living rooms, and left behind a specific kind of chill that lasted long after they departed. The Men in Black first appeared shortly after the November sightings began. In almost every account, the pattern was the same. You would receive a knock at the door. When you open it, you see one or two or sometimes three men standing on the porch in dark suits. Not modern dark suits, but older ones. The cut and fabric slightly off, as if assembled by someone who had studied suits in photographs rather than wearing them. Their face was described as oddly smooth, almost waxen, with complexions that seemed too uniform. Their eyes, when witnesses caught them in the light, were sometimes described as slightly too large. Their speech was formal, to the point of being mechanical, precise, and stilted in a way that felt rehearsed rather than natural. One of the most documented cases involved Mary Heyer, the Point Pleasant correspondent for the Athens Messenger newspaper. She was one of the few local journalists who took the sightings seriously enough to investigate them properly. Heyer was a meticulous reporter, not given to dramatics. She documented hundreds of sightings herself during the wave, maintaining files and following up with witnesses in person. And in early 1967, a man showed up at her office. He was short, slight, with very long black hair and enormous eyes behind thick glasses. He asked to review her files on the Mothman. His questions were odd. Not curious in the way a reporter's or researcher's questions are odd, but probing in a way she couldn't quite categorize. He seemed more interested in the names of witnesses she had spoken to, and when she asked his name, he gave her a business card she couldn't read clearly and left immediately. She never saw him again, but others like him kept appearing throughout the year, always showing up after significant sightings, always interested in who'd seen what and who had spoken to whom, always leaving behind that specific discomfort she described as feeling surveyed rather than visited. Another documented case involved a witness who, after speaking publicly about Mothman, received a visit from two men who warned him, without explaining why, that it was in his best interest to stop talking about what he had seen. The men drove an older model black Cadillac with a license plate that, when checked by witnesses, did not exist in any registry. A neighbor who watched the car drive away noted it had no exhaust vapor despite the cold night air. Researcher John Keel, who arrived in Point Pleasant in 1967 to investigate the wave firsthand, cataloged dozens of Men in Black encounters. He came to believe they were not government agents in the conventional sense. Not FBI, not Air Force intelligence. He thought they were something else, something attached to the same phenomenon as the Mothman itself. They were possibly extensions of whatever intelligence was operating in the region, enforcers of silence, managers of the narrative. Whether that made them more frightening or less was a question Keel never fully resolved. Before we fly further into the unknown, a quick word about how you can support What Dwells Beneath. If these journeys into the eerie and the unexplained keep you company on long drives or late nights, consider joining us on Patreon. For as little as $3 a month, you get early ad-free episodes, bonus deep dives into the regional legends, exclusive research notes, Q&A sessions, and the chance to suggest future topics. Higher tiers bring custom voice messages, behind-the-scenes audio, and even your name as a producer on select episodes. Patreon is what lets me chase these stories without compromise and keeps the show independent and strange. Head to patreon.com/whatdwellsbeneath and pick whatever tier feels right. Every pledge means more nights like this. Thank you to our existing Patreons. You're the reason the shadows stay deep. And if you have a creepy experience you would like to share, if you've ever felt watched from the treetops on a lonely back road, or seen something in the shadows you can't quite understand, please email us at whatdwellsbeneath@gmail.com. Your stories keep these shadows breathing. And speaking of creepy, if the Mothman was the terror that came from the sky, Indrid Cold was the terror that came from the road. And in some ways, the stories surrounding him are even more disturbing because they felt almost human. Almost. The first encounter with what would become known as the Grinning Man occurred in November 2nd, 1966, roughly 10 days before the Gravedigger sightings that opened the Mothman wave. Woodrow Derenberger was driving home from work along Interstate 77 near Parkersburg, West Virginia, when a gray, panel-shaped vehicle cut him off and hovered directly in front of his car, lowering to the road surface without any visible means of support. A man got out. He was tall, taller than average, with a dark complexion and hair that swept back from his face in an unusual way. He wore a dark coat that didn't seem to quite fit his body. His expression was fixed in an enormous, unblinking smile. Not the warm smile of a friendly stranger, something wider, something that seemed to have been placed on his face rather than grown there naturally. The man, who would eventually identify himself as Indrid Cold, spoke to Derenberger telepathically, not in words transmitted through air, but directly into his thoughts. And it gave him this warm, familiar feeling that Derenberger found profoundly unsettling precisely because part of him found it comforting. Cole told him he was a traveler and that he came from a place called Lamulus, that he meant no harm, that he was there merely observing. He asked Derenberger's name, his occupation, and the general details of his life. Then he returned to his craft and disappeared into the sky. Derenberger reported the encounter to the police and local news, and then the visits continued. Indrid Cold contacted Derenberger repeatedly over the following months, sometimes physically appearing at his home or alongside his car on the rural roads. Sometimes it was purely telepathic. His voice arrived in the middle of the night without warning. Cold would speak about Lanulus as this paradise world without fear or conflict, and then these descriptions were mixed with dark and specific predictions about events in Point Pleasant and the wider world. He seemed to know things that he shouldn't know. He asked questions that were a little too pointed. He smiled constantly, always that vast, fixed, manufactured smile. And he never blinked. Derenberger would go and write a book about his experiences with Indrid Cold. His family reported that the visitations, combined with the public mockery that followed his disclosure, gradually dismantled the life he had known before that November night on the highway. He lost his marriage, his reputation, and years of his life. He died in 1990, still insisting that everything he had experienced was real. Many researchers believe Indrid Cold and the Mothman were not separate phenomenon, but expressions of the same underlying intelligence, both coming from possibly the same place. Mothman provided a physical shock, while Cold provided a more subtle, more intimate intrusion. Where the Mothman announced itself with primal terror, Cold worked his way in slowly, conversationally, through the front door of the mind rather than the back. Between them, they covered every register of dread. And perhaps that was the point. By the fall of 1967, Mothman sightings have been building for more than a year, and they have not slowed down. If anything, they even intensified. In the weeks before December 15th, multiple Point Pleasant residents began reporting something new and specific. The creature was seen perched on the Silver Bridge itself. The Silver Bridge was a point of civic pride. Completed in 1928, it was one of the first I-bar chain suspension bridges in the United States, named for its aluminum paint that caught the light and made it gleam over the Ohio River even on gray days. It connected Point Pleasant, West Virginia to Gallipolis, Ohio, carrying Route 35 across the water, and with it the daily movement of workers, families, and commerce that was the lifeblood of both communities. In 1967, the bridge was carrying far more than it had been designed for. Traffic had increased substantially since the 1920s, and the vehicles crossing it were heavier. But inspections were routine, the structure deemed sound. No one was worried about the Silver Bridge. It had always been there. It felt like something permanent. December 15th, 1967 was a Friday. Rush hour. The bridge was dense with vehicles. Cars and trucks sitting bumper to bumper in the pre-Christmas traffic. People heading home to families and weekend plans. The ordinary business of living in Point Pleasant. The temperature was in the low 40s and the river below was dark and very cold. At 5:04 p.m., a single I-bar link on the north side of the bridge, one of the 700 bars in the chain system, corroded by decades of stress and small original manufacturing defect that had never been detected. It cracked and failed. The chain broke, and in less than 60 seconds, the entire bridge collapsed into the Ohio River. 60 seconds, and 46 people died. Survivors described a sound like a gunshot, then a groan, then the terrible tilting sensation of the roadway beneath them becoming something else. No longer solid, no longer trustworthy, no longer anything a human body could stand on. Cars plunged into the river, still occupied. Some sank quickly, others turned into the current. The water was dark and freezing and full of wreckage. People drowned in their cars. People who could swim were pulled under by debris. Emergency responders arrived to a scene that looked less like a bridge failure than a bomb strike. The community search for victims lasted weeks. Some bodies were recovered immediately, while others were found miles downriver in the days and weeks following. 2 were never recovered at all. Among the dead were entire families, co-workers who had carpooled together, people who had crossed that bridge every single day of their adult life without a second thought. Point Pleasant went silent in a way that no description fully captures. This wasn't just grief for an individual. It was grief for an entire community. It left a wound in the collective body of the town. And in the immediate aftermath, the Mothman sightings stopped. Not slowed, stopped. As if whatever had been watching and circling had accomplished or witnessed whatever it came for. People would ask later, with the particular anguish that comes from hindsight, if the Mothman was trying to warn them, why didn't anyone understand? Why didn't no one look at the winged figure perched on the bridge structure and understand what that meant? If you've read about the Mothman at any depth, you know about the name John Keel. And if you don't, you should. Keel was a journalist, researcher, and writer who had spent years investigating UFO phenomena before he arrived in Point Pleasant in 1967, drawn by the wave of strange reports emerging from the Ohio Valley. He was not a credulous man. He was systematic, a skeptic of easy answers, and deeply uncomfortable with both the mainstream UFO community's conclusions and the quick, conventional debunking of what people saw. He came to Point Pleasant looking for patterns. He found something he wasn't entirely prepared for. Keel spent months in the region, interviewing hundreds of witnesses, mapping the sighting locations, tracking the UFO activity, cataloging the Men in Black encounters, and attempting to construct a model that could account for the full, sprawling, internally consistent weirdness of what was happening. He drove the back roads at night. He listened to the phone static. He followed leads that went nowhere and found things in the going nowhere that surprised him. Keel eventually published 2 books, and they are resource materials for this episode. The first book was in 1970, called UFOs, Operation Trojan Horse, and later his second book, called The Mothman Prophecies, in 1975. Both of these books helped him develop a framework called the ultra-terrestrial theory. Keel's argument was that the entities people encountered during high strangeness events were not extraterrestrials in the science fiction sense, which are visitors from distant planets in physical spacecrafts. What people in Point Pleasant were experiencing was something stranger and closer. He believes what people were experiencing in Point Pleasant was an intelligence that existed alongside human consciousness, possibly from overlapping or adjacent dimensions, capable of manipulating our perception of reality in ways that mimicked whatever our cultural imagination was primed to see. In other words, the Mothman looked like a winged man creature because that was the symbol our minds could hold. The Men in Black looked like government agents because that was what we feared. Injured Cold smiled and spoke about paradise because that was what part of us wanted. The intelligence behind the phenomenon was using our own symbolic vocabulary against us, or perhaps communicating through it in the only language we were capable of receiving. Keel never claimed certainty. He made it very clear that his framework was a working model, not a conclusion. But he was certain for one thing, that dismissing the witnesses of Point Pleasant as hysterical or lying was not just intellectually lazy, but morally wrong. These people had experienced something real. Whatever that something was, it left its mark. This brings us to the most enduring and perhaps most deeply felt interpretation of the Mothman, the Harbinger theory. The idea is not new. In Appalachian and Ohio Valley folklore, the tradition of winged omens, death birds, and sky messengers stretches back centuries, absorbed from indigenous traditions blended with European folklore brought over by Scotch, Irish, and German settlers. This then crystallized by the particular isolation and hardship of mountain life into a set of beliefs that were not supernatural in the way the word often implies, but practical, functional. Warnings were warnings. You paid attention to them. Looking at these traditions and comparing them to Mothman, you notice how well it fits. The great winged death figure, the Thunderbird, the psychopomp who appears at a threshold between the living world and whatever lies beyond it. In this theory, the Mothman is not malevolent. He's not causing the disasters associated with his appearance. He is preceding them, the way storm clouds precede rain, carrying the signal of something already in motion that human perception cannot yet detect. The post-1967 sightings seem to support this pattern, or at least make it compelling enough that dismissal feels wrong. Workers at the Chernobyl nuclear plant reported encounters with a large, dark, winged figure with glowing red eyes in the days before the 1986 explosion, the worst nuclear disaster in history. Multiple witnesses described the same creature appearing in their dreams and near the reactor buildings in the nights leading up to the disaster. On the very morning of the explosion, several workers reported seeing the dark shape one final time before alarms began to sound. In September 2001, residents of Lower Manhattan and witnesses later compiled by researchers reported seeing a large dark figure with wings circling above the World Trade Center in the days before September 11th. The descriptions are consistent: enormous wingspan, red eyes, circling behavior. And that is parallel to Point Pleasant. It's so direct, it's uncomfortable. In 2007, the collapse of the I-35 highway bridge in Minneapolis, which killed 13 people in August of that year, was preceded by a cluster of local sightings of a large winged creature near the bridge structure. The pattern repeats: winged figure, a bridge, red eyes, sightings that stop when the disaster occurs. What do we do with this pattern? Science offers no framework for it. Folklore offers a very old one. Some things exist at the edges of the world, and their function is to stand at the threshold of catastrophe and witness. Whether or not anyone on the other side of that threshold can understand what they're seeing in time. From the Harbinger theory, other explanations branch out into even stranger territory. Some researchers see Mothman as an interdimensional traveler or an ultra-terrestrial being, something that slips through thin places in reality during times of collective stress or upheaval. The heavy UFO activity, the men in black harassment, the telepathic communications with Indra Cold, and the sudden wave of high strangeness all suggest a larger paranormal outbreak. Others tie Mothman directly to the TNT Area's history, a mutated creature born from decades of chemical contamination, or possibly a manifestation of the collective psychic trauma of a community that had spent years living adjacent to bunkers full of things designed to kill. Still, others reach toward the government. Experimental technology, holographic projection, or possibly psychological warfare research conducted in the aftermath of the Cold War programs that turned the TNT area into what it is today. The more folkloric interpretations see Mothman as a modern evolution of something much older, given form and wings, and bright red eyes. And then there are the grounded explanations, offered not to dismiss, but to complete the picture. Some researchers have pointed to the sandhill crane, a large gray bird with a wingspan up to nearly 8 feet and bright red markings on its face. Seen at night, lit by headlights, startled into flight from the roadside, it's not too difficult to understand how frightened minds might transform this into something monstrous. You can also take a look at barn owls, whose eyes can reflect ambient light dramatically and whose silent flight has unnerved human beings for as long as we've shared the dark with them. They even appear in other explanations. Some other legitimate factors are mass hysteria and media feedback loops. Once the story was in the papers, once the Scarberry's account had been printed and spread, the entire region was primed to see what they were looking for. Fear is contagious. Suggestion is powerful. And the TNT area, with its bunkers, contaminated wetlands, and its reputation already established a place where the air felt wrong. This provided the perfect atmospheric conditions under which suggestion could bloom into belief. Yet, many skeptics admit the problem of the timing. The Mothman, whatever he was, stopped appearing in Point Pleasant when the Silver Bridge fell. That's not nothing. That is a fact that sits in the center of every rational explanation and refuses to move. We've walked together in the haunted timeline with the Mothman tonight. From the first grave digging sighting to the terror of the dark roads of the TNT area, from the Men in Black to the falling of the Silver Bridge. Whether he is a true harbinger of doom, an interdimensional messenger, a product of contaminated earth and fear, or something our minds may never fully grasp, one truth remains. When Mothman appears, the world is about to shift. Point Pleasant still honors the legend. The Mothman Museum on Main Street holds decades of eyewitnesses' accounts, physical evidence, and the cultural record of a community that was marked by something and never fully understood. The annual Mothman Festival draws thousands of visitors every September. Researchers, believers, curious skeptics, and people who just want to stand in the town where it all happened. They all come together and try to feel if anything lingers. You also have guided tours of the TNT area, and they run at dusk. The guides will tell you that a significant number of visitors report, without any prompting, that the air near the old igloos feels different, heavier. But if this episode stirred something in you, a sighting you've never told anyone, a dream you couldn't shake, a shadow that crossed the moon at the wrong angle, share it with me. Email us at whatdwellsbeneath@gmail.com. Your experiences may end up in an episode in the near future. In the next episode, we're going to be covering a story that has been told in the whispers along the Appalachian Ridgeline for generations, and that a handful of hikers and hunters in the last decade claim it's far from legend. Until then, keep one eye on the night sky. What dwells beneath might be watching from above.